Hello lovely people, today we will be testing some mid-range speakers. I wanted to do this test for quite a while and only now I kind of found time and I have another different mid-range to test. So I did a similar test probably last year when I was testing 6.5-inch mid-bass drivers and I was testing the distortion and on and off axis frequency response. In my hands now I have three very different mid-range drivers. They cannot be any more different than they are. So let's have a look at them. This one is a Faital Pro, where is it? 3FE25. So this is a mid-range driver made by a pro audio company that has a big massive magnet and is supposed to be high sensitivity and get very low. It is a very cheap driver, it's like 20 pounds or something, but the main thing, it has a typical normal cone with a dome dust cap. This is the most important thing. The second in line is my Status mid-range HDZ 653. So I have currently these in my car. I just pulled it out just for this test. So this has a neodymium magnet, which doesn't matter because the main difference is the cone. And so this is a carbon fiber cone, but it has a face plug that is not attached to the actual cone. So it should have different dispersion characteristics compared to a normal dome dust cap. And we're going to see if there is a difference. And now the third one, this is not mine, this is my friend's, and he recently bought this. So this is a Morel CDM 600, which is a soft dome mid-range. So this is, you can see it's a dome, it's soft, similar to a tweeter, but this is a dome mid-range. So these three mid-ranges are as far apart as it possible. And the most important thing for me is going to be testing the frequency response on and off axis. How are they different? Not the actual frequency response, which is more linear, which has breakups and everything, but how the frequency response changes when you have the driver on axis and you go different degrees off axis. Does this face plug help at higher frequencies? And does the dome mid-range have a totally different dispersion characteristics compared to a typical normal driver? So this is what we're going to be testing as well. At the same time, because I'm going to have them in there, I'm going to test the distortion at the same output level. Output, I mean dB. So I'm going to set them at the same decibels and just see where the distortion is and everything, just because I need to find a good crossover point for this one because I have absolutely no idea and I will be installing them. So I need to test it, how low I can cross it. And as a bonus point for this mid-range, we're going to test their frequency response in like a free baffle or a sealed enclosure and in these little pods. So I do have a video about these pods, watch it before, and we're going to see how big is the difference between a driver being in a lot of airspace versus in a small tiny little pod. So let's begin. First set of measurements. So I'm measuring the dome. So I decided to use like my old home speakers, which I did just a baffle and just a hole, so because I don't want to build a new box anyway. So the speaker is the same level as the microphone, and I'm testing as well because this comes with different grills. So the main measurements I'm doing with no grills, then I'll put this grill and I'm putting the mesh just to see if there's a difference between mesh and grill and nothing. And then literally what I do, I just take the speaker, rotate it 30 degrees, 45, 60. I am eyeballing it. It's not exact science because it's fine for that. And I'm going to have the results. So this one is done as well. I did the distortion measurements. We're going to have a look at the distortion for this because I need to choose a crossover point. But you can see this is basically, these are three measurements without grill, with the mesh grill, and with the grill. Yeah, and now I'm gonna do the same with the Faital Pro and then the Status, and then we can compare because I have, see here, 0 degrees, 30, 60, 45. Yeah, fun stuff. I'm finished with my measurements. This is the Status one, the final driver. So as a reminder, we had a Faital Pro that has like a normal cone and everything. Then we had the dome, and then we had the status. So first of all, let's have a look at the distortion. So I tried to measure all of these drivers at the same level. So this is on-axis response of the status, the Faital Pro, and the Morel dome. So you can see the response at 1K, because this one kind of centers at 1K. It's about 90 dB level at 1K. The response is different. The dome rolls off because I had to choose different crossovers, but the level is kind of the same, similar. So if we go to overlays and we have a look at the distortion, let's start with THD. So this is on axis the dome tweeter. Oh, I need to remove all of these, and I need to add this. So this is the total THD at 90 dB level. And we can see, if we're gonna go one by one, the dome mid-range, the Morel, you can see it's 1% at about 3K, which is this most sensitive area. And it does have a peak here. I did cross it at 500 Hertz because it doesn't like to be crossed lower. I did try some others, so this is like 100 Hertz. Crossed at 100 Hertz, you can see distortion is 20%. So obviously they don't play low. Then I tried 400 Hertz, 500 Hertz, 600 Hertz, and I ended up, so 600 gives a little bit less here, like 3% instead of 5, but that's at 400 Hertz where the level is very low anyway. So I think a safe crossover for this mid is something like 500 Hertz at 24 dB. Because if you cross it lower, like this appears here at 300, so it could be a bit lower, but 500 seems a good crossover. Now, the Faital Pro, I did cross it at 200 Hertz, so it can play much lower. And you can see it's kind of stable. If you cross it lower, I don't have that measurement. Basically here, it starts to climb up. So 200 Hertz is kind of a good crossover. And the status, the one that I'm running, I'm crossing it in my car at about 200 Hertz, but I'm chopping off a little bit of the bottom response as well. So this is the difference between 200 and 250 Hertz crossover. So with 200 Hertz crossover, I have some here, 150 Hertz, but then if I cross it a bit higher, 200, it kind of flat-ish. So 250, 24 dB looks like a good crossover. So if we're comparing the dome against the status, we can see that this is the total THD. It's kind of similar. The dome one has more distortion in the lower mid-range and a little bit higher. The status has a peak at 1K, and the rest is kind of similar. If we bring into the equation the Faital Pro, which is very, very cheap, 3-inch driver, 3.5, 3-inch driver, the distortion is very similar. So if I'm going to remove the dome, so this is Faital Pro against the status. At higher frequencies is the same. At the lower mid-range here, between like 400 and 1K, you can see it has much higher distortion at 1.5%, where status stays at 0.5%. And then the roll-off of distortion is the same. However, they crossed, actually it's similar. This one is at 200, this is 250 Hertz. So very similar crossover. So distortion-wise, THD total is kind of similar. Let's have a look at the second harmonic. So second harmonic, status and the Faital Pro, very similar. Again, status has a little bit more in the lower mid-range. If we have a look at the dome tweeter, the dome has very low distortion here, especially in this range. Second harmonic, but second harmonic peaks up at about 400 Hertz. So it goes up to like 4%, which is, but yeah, they don't play low. There's no point of crossing it at 1000 Hertz just to bring it down, because what's the point of the mid if you're going to cross it at 1000 Hertz? But the biggest difference is the third harmonic, which is the nasty one. So this is the third. I'm going to remove the Faital Pro for a bit. So this is the third harmonic. The dome is the purple one, and you can see it has much higher harmonic, third harmonic in here, where we are the most sensitive to all that stuff, and it's like close to 1%, whereas the status is very low, has a little bit more here, and then dome again has much more harmonics and the lower frequency of 400. But this is the difference between a cheap driver and an expensive one. So Faital Pro against the status. Total THD is kind of similar, second harmonic similar, frequency response similar, but this is a third harmonic, the nasty one, the one that sounds worse. So the third harmonic on the status is everywhere 0.5% and below. For the Faital Pro, the third harmonic is 1% and even more at 2% at 200 hertz. So from this, if you disregard the frequency response, from the distortion point of view, Faital Pro is going to sound much harsher compared to the status, because status third harmonic is much lower. It is a bit higher here at the higher frequencies, but in lower frequency range, it's much less. So this is the distortion. Now let's have a look at the frequency response. So as I mentioned, I measured at 0, 30, 45, and 60. Now it is a bit of a mess. So let's add some smoothing. 1/6, how does it look on 1/6? Yeah, it's not bad. So from this we can see that this dome mid-range, the Morel, it plays cross at 500. So it plays like from 500 up to 10K. So it doesn't play the very high end. However, if you noticed, even without no smoothing, there is no big massive peaks. Let me remove everything and leave only the 0 degree on axis. And I'm gonna remove all the smoothing. So this is on axis with no smoothing. And you can see these dips are because of reflections. This is because of reflections, maybe baffle reflections and stuff. Everything is fine. But this, there's no peaks, massive peaks or anything on the higher frequency, because this dome mid-range, apparently, it doesn't have any breakup. Similar to like a ring radiator, I want to say. There's no prominent breakup, cone breakup or anything. So this is amazing. It does roll off by itself at 10K. Now one test I did is I tested with a grill and with a mesh. And we can see there's maybe something here, but that could be reflection. And here, maybe a little bit at the top end, but if you're using with no grill, with mesh grill, or with regular grill, it doesn't make a difference at all. So that's totally fine. We're gonna be using this with a grill, so that's perfect. And again, if we're gonna have a look, 45, 60, and 30. So the main difference that we can see between these different angles is a very nice top end roll off. So we have 30 degrees here, it's kind of starting to roll off, then 45, and then 60. So it does roll off very nicely with like predictability. It's just a literal roll off. Now let me show you Faital Pro. So Faital Pro is a typical speaker with a cone dust cap, like most speakers. So we're gonna have zeros, this, and this. And here we have, okay, so I'm not gonna apply any smoothing yet. So let's have a look at one by one. On axis, it's like this. It has a rising top end, and this is the cone breakup at 10K, which dome mid-range doesn't have. And all speakers have a cone breakup. It's either a little bit dampened or not. So this is extreme cone breakup, so it plays a lot of high frequencies. If we turn it 30 degrees off axis, it's totally smooth. There is a cone breakup, but it's smooth. However, here we do have these cancellations kind of starting to happen. Then if we're gonna go 45 degrees, we can see, I'm gonna remove this and this. We can see this nasty dip, two dips. So this is kind of comb filtering and very nasty cancellations. And at 60 degrees, it's even worse. You can see this. So if you compare, let's add the smoothing 1/6. It's gonna see the smoothing removes the big dips. So this is 60 degrees on Faital Pro, and this is 60 degrees on Dome. And you can see the Dome, even with no smoothing, is it? This. It does have something here, a little bit. You can see if I'm gonna just move a little bit down just to see it a bit better. It does have something here, but is not as pronounced because the level obviously is dropping. So it's not as pronounced as on the Faital Pro. And this is happening because somebody was trying to explaining to me online previously. So when you have a speaker playing towards you, everything comes from the cone. When you start tilting it off axis, what happens is that you have one sound source, which is this cone side, and then the other sound source, which is this cone side, and they have a distance between them. And if they arrive at your listening position, at you, out of phase, these two sound sources, they cancel each other out. And that's why you have this massive, massive dip. So this is a property of all cone drivers when you play them off axis. But again, you wouldn't be playing this all the way up. And now let's have a look at the status. So status we have on axis, again, very similar to the Faital Pro on axis. Everything here is extremely similar. This is the dip that I said that the status exhibits. Oh, it's a bit higher, 4.5K. Oh, the mid bass. The mid bass has this dip at 1K and the mid range at 4.5K. So this dip is because of the phase plug, I think. And then we have kind of something like a cone breakup, but the main cone breakup is here at, what's the frequency? 18K, 17, 18K. And this is the property of the extra stiff cone, which is the carbon fiber. This is paper. It's not as stiff as carbon fiber, so it breaks up in lower frequencies. And carbon fiber, since it's a much stiffer material, it breaks up at much higher frequency, which obviously you're not going to play it all the way up to 18K. Now let's have a look at the status off axis. So this is 0 degrees, that's 30 degrees. And already at 30 degrees, we're starting to see this dip just because of the phase plug, I would imagine, because something to do with the phase plug. Now, 45 degrees, surprisingly, it kind of fixes itself like this, but we have a dip here. And then at 60 degrees, we have this. So when you compare how drivers, these different drivers behave off axis, you can clearly see that the dome mid-range is a clear winner, because the only thing that it does, it rolls off. I'm going to remove the smoothing. There we go. You can see that it's very nicely rolls off. Something here starts to happen, but that's literally 9-10K, which is not an issue. But we have a very gradual roll-off with no massive things happening, similar to like here, this massive dip, or the Faital Pro at 45. When we have this, nothing similar happens to a dome mid-range. And when you think about how a speaker plays, the imaging wise, so imaging is the difference between like left and right and all the reflections combined. If you have a speaker that is kind of on axis or like off axis a little bit, you're gonna have a different frequency response going in different directions, as we saw with the measurements. And what that means that all the reflections, if they're not the same from different angles, when they're gonna come to you, they're gonna sound off. They might cancel each other out and that kind of stuff. And that's why it kind of not perfect for imaging. However, you can see dome mid-range, they play very nice in all directions. So all the reflections are controlled with no cancellations and very smooth. So ideally, in theory, again, this dome mid-range should be extremely good for imaging and staging. And I will see, because I will put this in a car. I'm going to tune it. We're going to cross it at 500 hertz, and we will see how it sounds. But measurement-wise, dome mid-range is a superior being, if we can say that. Yes, it doesn't play high, it doesn't play low, but what it does play, all of this, it plays extremely, extremely nice. So the last thing to test, because I did all of this, the last thing to test is to have this. We have this in a box over there, and now I'm gonna put it in a small sealed pod just to do one sweep, exactly the same, and we're gonna see if we can cross it a bit lower in a pod, and what is the difference in the frequency response when you put it in the pod. So for my last test, I'm running this dome mid-range in the pod. I have a frequency response to match the same level as if it was in that big box. So I have frequency response match, same crossover. I put it like this because all of the surroundings is going to change the frequency response, but it's not going to change the distortion, because distortion, that's what I'm interested in. So this is an empty pod that doesn't have anything in it. Next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit of stuffing, like this polyfill, just a little bit, just to see if it does anything. And then we're going to compare how this driver behaves if you put it in an open baffle, such as a dash or an open pillar, versus when you put it in a pod, an empty pod, or with some filling. Just to show you how much I'm adding, is just literally this much. So yeah, very, very little. Just in there, not stuffed, just fluffy, and see if it's gonna make a difference. And final results. So this is 3 measurements, 1 in the baffle and 2 in the pod. One is in the empty pod and the other one is a slightly stuffed pod. So in the baffle, we can see these like jigginess or ragginess is because of the baffle, because it's like reflections from the sides and everything, which is totally fine. Then we have the pod is a much smoother response. The bottom end, which is surprising, doesn't change at all. And this is what I was speculating, because we're crossing this mid-range quite high at 500 hertz. So there's no peak at the lower end, because if you have a conventional driver such as this and it plays down to like 150 hertz, then at like 300 hertz you're gonna have straight and then you're gonna have a peak in there. But with this, as I suspected, there's nothing, so the pod does not influence the actual frequency response. Now the difference between a stuffed and unstuffed pod, there's no difference. There is slight, but it could be contributed due to a little bit difference in angle, because I removed the pod, I want to have to disassemble it, so it could be because of that. I wouldn't say it's because of the actual stuffing. Now, the most interesting thing is the distortion. Let's have a look at the distortion. So this is in the baffle, and as I mentioned, in the baffle we have a rise here, dip, and then a little peak up to 5% here. When you put the driver in the pod, you have this. So we have a little bit more distortion here, a tiny bit, but it's still, everything is below 1%, and less at the higher frequencies, and this peak goes away. See, so this the blue one is with stuffed. So when you stuff it, there is a little peak here as well, but without no stuffing, you can see it's the most beautiful thing, which is everything below 1%, a little bit here at 400, but the level is very, very low. I did try with an empty pod different crossovers just to see if I can cross it a bit lower. So this is a 400 and a 300 hertz, and you can see it goes all the way up to 10%. So this is a big no. You cannot cross it any lower. The crossover stays the same at 500, maybe like 480 or 470 just here, because the level is very low at 350 hertz. But still, 500 hertz, 24 dB. Everything is kind of below 1%, which is very, very cool. So now I know that these drivers behave very nice in these pods. So if you're planning to install these Morel dome mid-ranges in the pods, don't put any stuffing, leave it empty, and cross it at 524 dB. regardless if you're gonna put it in the baffle, in a dash or a pill or whatever. 500, 550 is gonna be a perfect crossover for them. But now I know. Now I know how to start tuning. The initial crossovers are done based on distortion measurements and everything. So very, very cool. This dome mid-range should sound spectacular. And I just need to tune it and see what happens. So follow the future videos when I'm going to be installing it and tuning the whole Honda Jazz new system, the upgrade. And thank you very much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.